Alan Wake isn't a horror game, though there is horror to be found in it. And while it may dance, flirt, and reference classic horror tropes and visuals, its main narrative is paced as an episodic supernatural thriller. It also happens to be one of my favorite games of all time. And while the concept of shadowy possessed madmen besieging you from all sides in a dark Pacific Northwestern forest is rather horrific in the immediacy of its danger, the idea that I find most terrifying is the loss of agency. Or perhaps the revelation that one never had it to begin with. Alan Wake presents a story of creator versus creation, art versus the artist. But one of the most disquieting questions asked is which? So let's talk about the true existential horror lurking just below the surface of Cauldron Lake. As always, this isn't an explanation. This is simply Before we can talk about the underlying horror of Alan Wake, we have to talk about, well, Alan Wake, both the game and the marquee character. In Alan Wake, you take control of Alan, internationally famous author and notorious problematic artist, as he and his wife Alice take a vacation to the quiet Pacific Northwestern town of Bright Falls. You see, while Alan's works have made him famous, the last book in his series ended with him killing off beloved protagonist Alex Casey, in the hopes that doing so would allow him to hone his craft and produce something of real artistic merit. There's only one problem. Alan's kind of a crap writer whose doubts and insecurities have ultimately left him with writer's block, and his once famously successful marriage on the brink of collapse.
Just don't! I don't want to hear it! God damn it, Alice!
Hence the sabbatical. After meeting a few of the locals,
Mr. Wake, Alan Wake, oh God!
And driving to their private cabin on the edge of Cauldron Lake, things almost immediately go bad as Alan argues with Alice over her hope of the trip serving as a cure for his writer's block.
I guess I have a small confession to make. I thought maybe you could write here.
Only for her mere moments later to fall over the dock railing and into the lake.
Oh no!
As Alan dives in to save her, he suddenly awakes to find himself in the driver's seat of the couple's rental van, tipping precariously over the edge of a cliff, with no memory of how or why he arrived in the situation. From here, Alan is continuously assaulted by shadowy crazed men.
I need help! Listen, I need to...
Premium cabins for rent in Nightfall!
Oh, hell.
Discovers the cabin that he and Alice had rented hadn't existed for years.
There's no island on Cauldron Lake, not since the big eruption in the 70s.
Is reunited and aided by his literary agent,
Barry Wheeler.
Accosted by opportunistic self-help guru, Dr. Emil Hartman.
I'd like to invite you to stay at Cauldron Lake Lodge.
Did you talk to my wife?
Threatened with Alice's safety by a mysterious kidnapper seeking a new manuscript.
Alan, please help me.
Alice?
Stop talking to the law. You'll do exactly what I say if you ever want to see your wife again.
Pursued by a rogue FBI agent with a chip on his shoulder and a hidden agenda.
This is Agent Nightingale, FBI! Get him up, Hemingway!
And finally forced to confront the game's true antagonist, an evil eldritch entity known as the Dark Presence, which preys on artists' creativity, in a bid to win freedom from the confines of its prison at the bottom of the lake. Having spirited Alice away as a means to this end by forcing Alan to write a story that would not only free it but empower it as well.
I am much older than you. Older than your first work of art. I will find a new face to wear. Someone else to dream me free.
Only for Alan to overcome it using a literal literary MacGuffin. and with one page left to finish the story, Alan trades places with Alice, freeing her and damning himself to the dark place at the bottom of the lake, leaving us with one of the greatest ending stinger lines of all time. It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
Alan, wake up.
Of course, my brief synopsis doesn't really do the game justice, having omitted a number of important supporting characters and plot points. But it gives us a pretty good jumping off point, because Alan isn't the only writer in this story. Thomas Zane is a name you'll hear quite a bit over the course of Alan Wake. Thomas was a writer and poet who was madly in love with the most beautiful woman in Bright Falls, Barbara Yeager, and lived together happily in Bird Leg Cabin on the edge of Cauldron Lake. Thomas Zane is also a legend, with no records of ever having existed, and only remembered by a pair of geriatric rockers, the town eccentric, the manic light-obsessed Cynthia Weaver, and one other. Despite what most of the residents of Bright Falls believe, Thomas was real, until he encountered the Dark Presence. Due to his proximity to the lake, Thomas became aware of its reality-manipulating properties, and stopped writing altogether, preferring to spend his days donning his diving suit and exploring beneath the waves. One day, however, Barbara drowned in Cauldron Lake, convinced that the bottom held a treasure. During his period of bereavement, Thomas's former assistant writer, Emil Hartman, proposed that Thomas write her back, as he had also become aware of the lake's abilities. And so Thomas did, and his beautiful Barbara returned to him, as a vessel for the Dark Presence. For a time the two seemed happy, but Thomas soon realized Barbara's true nature, and in an effort to correct his mistake, tied her to a chair and cut out her heart. But she didn't die. In writing Barbara back, Thomas had broken the rules of the narrative that was his life. So, in one final act, he wrote all of his novels and poems out of existence, with a single caveat. Anything related to him kept in shoeboxes would remain. Climbed into his diving suit one final time, and descended to the bottom of the lake, clutching the creature that had once been his beloved Barbara. While it's unknown how many shoeboxes Zane left, 2 are discovered in-game. The first, when Alan and Alice arrive at the cabin, containing a number of his published novels, which, when examined, causes Alan to remark that he had never heard of Zane. The second is revealed to Alan by Cynthia Weaver in the well-lit room at the end of Chapter 5, and contains only 2 items: a broken light switch and a manuscript page, which details an incident involving a child and his mother, who, in an attempt to combat the boy's nighttime fear of the dark, tells him that the switch, referred to as the clicker, can be used to banish any and all monsters in darkness. The child is revealed to be Alan, and the page goes on to further describe his standing in the well-lit room, reading the page. A page written by Zane 39 years previous, 8 years before Alan's birth, leaving us with many questions, the most prominent being, did Thomas Zane create Alan Wake? Or did Alan take a series of desperate elements he'd heard and seen and use them to create a narratively useful version of Zane? It's an intriguing idea. 2 writers unsure if one created the other. While Wake's story features a decided lack of existential navel-gazing at the premise, there is one other character that seemingly exemplifies it.
That's right, James Joyce. It's your fault and you're gonna pay for it.
Robert Nightingale is a minor secondary antagonist in Alan Wake. If that description seems a little brief, that's because it's the most apropos. Agent Nightingale isn't a character. He's a plot device. Though he might also be one of the most self-aware individuals in Alan Wake. But before we can talk about that, we need to ask, who is Robert Nightingale? By the time we meet Agent Nightingale, he's a disgraced former FBI agent who, under false pretenses, has commandeered the Wake case.
Agent Nightingale, FBI! Get him up, Hemingway! You're under arrest! You move a muscle, I'll unload right in your goddamn face!
Agent Nightingale is woefully underwritten when compared to nearly every other character in Alan Wake. And there's a good reason for that. Robert Nightingale is a holdover from an entirely different story. As Alan explains in Episode 3, the manuscript began as a mystery thriller, hence the entire Episode 2 through 4 subplot involving Alice's kidnapping. But thanks to Barbara's interference as Alan's editor, the story quickly veers off into horror, leaving Nightingale as an ancillary character stranded in a genre story he's not suited for. In a thriller, Nightingale would have served as the perfect foil for Alan, abrasive, drunk, and unwilling to listen to Alan's pleas of innocence. But for the horror story that Alan Wake becomes, Agent Nightingale comes off as a crazed lunatic, as he ascribes blame to Alan for incidents he could have never perpetrated, to the point that nearly every face-to-face encounter between the two ends with him wildly firing at Wake.
Stay right where you are, Zane!
That, however, isn't the most interesting aspect of Agent Nightingale. While it's never stated outright, there's a strong implication that Robert is at least partially aware of the fact that he's living out a work of fiction, given his immediate and unprovoked contempt of Wake, which is punctuated by his habit of dismissively addressing Alan as writers of greater renown, and by the manuscript page entitled Nightingale at the Majestic.
Even behind the closed doors and curtains of his grimy room at the Majestic, the local motel, Nightingale could feel the locals' eyes on him, the unrelenting pressure of their judgment. He forced it out of his mind. For all he knew, they could all be under Wake's spell already. You do what you have to do to get the job done. He took comfort from the bottle in his hand. Please, he thought, just let me get through this.
This leads to a rather unsettling question. Is the Robert Nightingale we encounter over the course of the game the true one? That is to say, is he the man he would be without the manuscript's influence? Or did Alan, and by possible extension Thomas, destroy an innocent man's career and life all in service of a story that he doesn't belong in? It's fascinating that this question is addressed to a small degree at the very beginning of the game, during a dream sequence that serves as a tutorial level, in which Alan accidentally runs down a hitchhiker, only to be pursued and berated over not only his lack of talent, but the thoughtless handling of his characters' lives by the man's angry specter.
You don't even recognize me, do you, Ryder? You think you're God? You think you can just make up stuff? Play with people's lives and kill them when you think it adds to the drama?
A fate similar to Nightingale's own, who in Chapter 5 is unceremoniously removed from the story without thought or comment from any of the other characters.
Business.
Whoa! Get back in the cell, Stephen King! The only way you're leaving this place is over my dead...
Wait a minute. I know this.
Only to reappear at the very end of the game as the new face of the Dark Presence. Who Robert Nightingale was, other than an FBI agent, is unimportant. A man with friends, family, a career, a life, transformed into the drunken, irrational, murderous Agent Nightingale we encounter. A life destroyed, all for a work of fiction made manifest. Alan Wake isn't a horror game, though there's horror to be found in it. Its horror is the existential sort, that comes with loss of free will, the loss of agency. And this horror touches every character in the game, Alan included, leaving we the player to wonder if any of the characters we meet are really who they're portrayed as, or if their fundamental natures have been altered in service of Alan's story. What of those taken by the dark presence? How many lives are destroyed for a work of fiction? And finally, Alan himself. Self-destructive, violent, troubled. Is the man we're presented as Alan Wake real? Or is he a character in Thomas Zane's last written work? Is a lifetime's worth of pain, struggle, and triumph nothing more than the designs of a dead author trapped in a story within a story? The horror of Alan Wake dwells within these unasked, unanswered questions. After all, as Alan so poignantly states at the beginning of the game, nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In the end, we may never know the truth behind who spawned the horror of Alan Wake. But what we do know is that Alan's story is far more devastating than what's written on the page. And that his own failings, not only as an author, but as a person, has left a path of death and destruction in his wake. But how much accountability can Alan truly have in the end? After all, he may only be the man Thomas Zane wrote him as, and nothing more. Of course, as always, that's simply my take. What's yours?
This boy's coming.